Welcome to Your Education Matters, now in our 5th year as a source of information about British Columbia education. Your Education Matters features the voices of professional educators and other education stakeholders. Today our guests are leaders in the BCNDP opposition. Robin Austin was re-elected as the MLA for Skeena in May 2009. He was first elected to the legislature in 2005. Robin serves as opposition critic for education and chair of the Caucus Committee on Social Policy. Mr. Austin was employed as a community schools coordinator for a nonprofit society in Terrace. Prior to entering the social work field, Robin spent 20 years working in the private sector for both large corporations and small businesses associated with the hotel tourism industry. Robin has a BA from Strathclyde University in Scotland, as well as a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Northern BC. Kathy Corrigan was elected MLA for Burnaby Deer Lake in 2009 and serves as official opposition deputy chair and critic for public safety and corrections. A strong advocate for public education, Kathy served 3 terms on the Burnaby Board of Education, including time as board chair. Kathy is a lawyer and public policy researcher by profession. She has also edited a legal journal and written about privatization and trade agreements. As a longtime community volunteer, Kathy spent many years serving on parent advisory committees and other organizations. We are pleased to welcome MLA leaders Robin Austin and Kathy Corrigan to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Welcome, Kathy and Robin. Welcome.
Thank you.
I wanted to start the program by asking you about one of the major issues in British Columbia public education, and that's the funding issue. Sure. First, I'd like to simply have you tell us whether or not you think the BC public schools are underfunded. That's been the debate between government and especially the BCTF.
Sure. Well, I think there were some major changes that took place as soon as the BC Liberal government took office in 2001. And they made some fundamental changes to the way that we fund our entire school system, most predominantly around the way that we fund kids with special needs. And they brought in a couple of pieces of legislation to help them enable them to do that, Bills 27 and 28, which 10 years later were actually ruled unconstitutional. But what it enabled them to do was to change some of the funding envelopes that had been created for special needs kids in terms of the variety of needs or learning challenges that they had. And they took some of those envelopes and folded them into the total grant, the per pupil student funding. The problem is that over 10 years, the monies that would have gone if those envelopes had remained as separate envelopes for special needs funding didn't keep up with inflation. It didn't keep up with the needs of the province. So what happened was the government was able to say, quite cleverly, that every year the per pupil student funding was going up, giving the impression that they were increasing the overall funding to the education system. The reality was, though, especially around special needs, that there was a huge deficit which school boards then had to cover, to make up for. And I think this whole argument of, is the school system underfunded? Well, clearly it has been underfunded over the last 10 years because, as I say, with school boards having to make allowances for those cuts that would have been there had Bills 27 and 28 not passed, then they wouldn't have had to make all the other cuts in different areas. So to that extent, it has been underfunded. And my colleague, Kathy, was a school trustee at the time, and I think she could probably give you quite a good...
Well, tell us what it looked like from your perspective as a school trustee.
It looked like cuts. It looked like cuts. And the reality was, I was a school trustee from 1999, and year after year we faced cuts. Now, the reason that we were given, apart from the legislation, we were told that it was going to give districts more autonomy to be able to make decisions. And there is a certain value. From the perspective of a trustee, it was good. But what we found as time went on is that more and more costs were being downloaded onto the school boards. For example, MSP increases, kindergarten came in, all-day kindergarten, it wasn't fully funded. There was the costs of carbon, the carbon emissions were, and the tools to measure, all sorts of different things. The costs were increasing. And then we just had a general envelope. So what we found, the reality was that a very efficient school district like ours, Burnaby, which had the second lowest administrative cost in the province. So very efficient. We were cutting services, and you know, I think most districts, special needs that Robin talked about, were being funded less than half or around half of the actual cost. So we were in Burnaby putting about twice as much as we were actually getting funding for. So they took away the funding envelopes, but they didn't keep the funding, and it translated into cuts,
So,
deep cuts.
if we look for the consequences of the underfunding, then you're pointing to special needs students right away.
Special needs students, and of course what resulted from this underfunding was a cut in all of the specialized teachers. That was the most significant thing that's happened in the last 10 years. And just to give some credence to this question, Madam Justice Susan Griffin, the High Court Supreme BC judge, who actually ruled on Bills 27 and 28, she used the figure of $275 million that had been saved by the government, essentially at the expense of our children, as a result of Bills 27 and 28. Now, just bear in mind, that's $275 million each and every year from the passage of those bills. So we're looking at quite a lot of money that was pulled out of the school system, while at the same time the government was able to say, oh, by the way, we're raising per-pupil student funding every year, and show a graph, you know, on the television screens that gave the average person who was looking at this and debate, saying, oh, well, they're actually raising school funding. No, they weren't. They certainly weren't keeping it up with inflation, nor with the needs of kids with special needs.
And is there any other category beyond special needs that you would point to from your experience?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the wide variety of special needs, so if you look at special needs not being just kids who are physically or mentally challenged, but if you look at, for example, ESL, and I come from an urban district, very urban district, where you have a high number of refugees, high number of immigrants, so the ability to serve those kids with English as a second language, or ELL as they call it now, was limited. So all those specialized kind of teachers, teacher librarians, and so on, is all decreased very significantly over the last 10 years. And you know, it puts tremendous pressure on the teachers in the classrooms when you have a real diversity. And of course, one of the things that have changed over the years as well is that we have more and more kids with greater and greater variety of challenges coming into the classrooms, where we've changed the model of schooling. We say there has to be inclusiveness. We have to have the kids in the classroom, and that is the right thing to do. And yet all of these changes are happening as the resources are being drained away. So it really created a huge challenge for teachers. But nevertheless, I don't want to give the impression that sometimes is given, is that we're in a mess in our schools. We do a fabulous jobs in our schools. And when I see the kids, you know, that used to come before the board, and the accomplishments that they had, and how well teachers do and districts do with the resources that they have, I have a great comfort in the fact that we have great kids graduating from our schools. But there's just more and more pressures being put on
Yes,
those
this is what makes it hard to draw the discriminations. We aren't interested in trashing the schools. We're proud of them, and yet something's amiss. And certainly we hear it from the teachers when they engage in job actions and so on. One way I look at it is the world could be coming here to study our schools instead of Finland if we had kept the funding where we had, and we don't find that. We have to fight hard to keep the system satisfactory to our people, whereas we could be the world leaders. So then you get into a question of, does everything in government have to be funded at a minimum level, or do you want to aspire to excellence in some areas? So in some areas I would rather fund a little over than a little under, and maybe this is one of those for me. So what would you do you think, to redress the situation should you find yourself as education minister in a few months?
Well, clearly, you know, we're having that debate in our caucus now, and we'll be bringing forward our platform before the election next year. But clearly, having spent so much time advocating and recognizing some of the deficits in terms of resources that have been pulled out of the system, I'm certainly looking at us making a contribution to try and bring back resources back into the school system. Because clearly, when you consider how much money has been pulled out year after year, it's going to take quite some time, but we have to, I think, as a new government, should we be given the trust of British Columbians, we need to make a start on making a reinvestment back into public education to help return that deficit and start to build up our school system to make sure that there's all the resources that are there. Because, as Kathy points out, you know, we have great teachers, professionals, we have great administrators, but they have essentially had to make up for the cuts that have come down as a result of Bills 27 and 28 and other decisions that the government has made. And I think they're probably stressed, very tired, and now they need to see a government that is going to be supportive by starting to make an injection back into the public school system.
Well, you know, our across-the-board funding in British Columbia and in the Commonwealth in general overall is probably much superior to the way things are done in the U.S. where districts decide. But one thing about the district method, if people want to fund their schools more, they vote and they tax themselves more, and they do so. And you kind of don't have that option here. Although I notice municipalities hold these sorts of referenda to decide whether to build a firehouse or a bridge. It's too bad the people of British Columbia can't express themselves on the public schools.
We could, you know, many years ago. I remember just before I became a trustee, you could. And in fact, I think it's still on the books that you can hold a referendum if you want to, in order to increase spending. But it's not something that's been done. I don't even know if I don't think it's ever been done. But you know, one of the challenges that you face when you have that kind of system where you say you can increase the taxes or you can go to the people, then you're always scrambling, and it's really hard to convince people. I think what you need, I like better the idea of a provincial government taking the leadership role and taking responsibility for the decisions that they make, and saying, is this a priority for us or not? And I think education absolutely is a priority for the future. And another, you know, danger, Paul, when you're talking about that ability to raise in one area as opposed to another, is that one of our biggest concerns is the lack of equity and the increasing inequality in this province. And education should be and can be one of the primary ways, maybe the way, that you can bring equality into your province.
Well, we have the widest bridge in the world,
Yes.
and I'm saying that we could have the schools that people came from all over the world to see. In the international rankings, Canada is the highest ranked English-speaking country, and British Columbia and Alberta are the two highest ranked provinces.
Yes.
So I'm not just blowing smoke here. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got a tremendous foundation to aspire to the highest levels of excellence. But one of our chronic problems has been labor unrest. What ideas do you think your party would bring to leadership to resolve the ongoing labor unrest that we've had?
Well, I think the first thing, and I'm not being facetious here, is to stop attacking the teaching profession. I think with the outset early on in their administration of Bills 27 and 28, the way it was imposed, you know, unilaterally over a weekend, stripping contracts, it kind of set the tone for how the relationship was going to take place between the government of the day and the BCTF. And it poisoned things, and I think made it very, very difficult, to the extent, I think, where, you know, even if a good idea came out of a BC Liberal mouth, it was immediately diminished by the teachers who felt so dismayed at their actions. It basically it held the profession and the job that they do, the important work that they do, to be not important, especially when you consider that they made all kinds of deals with other public sector workers, but somehow seemed to attack the teaching profession. So I think what we're going to do is, first of all, change that relationship. Have the teachers be a part of decision-making within the Ministry of Education. Ensure that, you know, the teachers are 42,000 individuals. They're the ones at the forefront of delivering education to our kids. And we need to make sure that they are part of the decision-making and treat them with respect. I think that if we at least start with that premise, that will certainly change things quite radically.
And Kathy?
I absolutely agree. That last word that you used, Robin, is I think the key one is respect. And I've heard so many teachers, when we were discussing Bill 22, which tried to do the same thing again, essentially, to the teachers, impose working conditions and so on. That's what I heard from teachers, is we feel respected by parents, we feel respected by our students, we feel respected by our colleagues and the administrators, but we don't feel respected by our employer, which is the government. And, you know, originally when the legislation was brought in, Bill 27 and 28, the reason the government said they did it was that the system was broken and they had to do it. But you know, Madam Justice Griffin said it wasn't. It was working. Labor negotiations were working. And so we have to get back to allowing things to be decided at the bargaining table and also having that fundamental respect for teachers who do such an important job.
Looks like a choice was made to have this be a wedge issue. Thank you. We'll be back in a moment.
So we see it in our curriculums, we see it in our school policies, we see it that the schools in many ways have become a reflection of the politics of the Western world. We have identified particular school subjects at the expense of other ones because they're seen as being better for the individual to be successful. And if you're measuring success in terms of economics, then true.
What is a school? What does a school look like based on the ethic of care?
How can a teacher maintain an ethical, caring relationship with 30 or 40 kids at any given time?
What do you teach? How do you teach it? You know, do you just go into school and teach about care? Of course not, because you still have academic expectations of reading and writing and arithmetic.
How do we then promote a culture of caring or a consciousness? That's what this project or this journey has been about.
Welcome back. Robin, you started life in the UK and raised in England, educated in Scotland, and you've also attended to issues in education in the United States. So would you do a little comparative education for us and tell us some of the lessons you've learned as you come to British Columbia and try to apply the best
Certainly,
of your
Paul.
experience?
I mean, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, of course, the way that they fund the education system in the United States is totally different from the way we do it here. As you've already alluded to earlier on, they do it by the local taxes that come from, essentially from the housing in the local areas, which means, of course, that if you live in a wealthy neighborhood with big, expensive homes, then the schools are correspondingly much better resourced. I'm very delighted that we don't approach it that way, and that we do, in fact, centrally gather taxes and then make sure that every child, every school district in British Columbia has an equitable amount of money, at least to start with, as a base grant. So that's a fundamental difference, and I'm happy that we do it that way. In regards to the UK, I think there's been some fundamental shifts in the UK over the last 25, 30 years. I left Britain sort of at the time of Margaret Thatcher, and I'm very glad I did for lots of reasons, but she made some fundamental changes to the UK education system. She had a Minister of Education, Sir Keith Joseph, who introduced the idea that education was no longer a public good, that it was really something to be sold, bought and sold in the marketplace, something which I fundamentally disagree with. You know, education is not a breakfast cereal or a new automobile to be sold. It's much more complicated than that, and it's a public good. But he introduced the idea of parents having choice and competing from one school to another. He took away the fact that parents no longer had to take their kid to the local community school that was in their neighborhood. He broke away catchment areas and found different funding models to try and encourage kids to essentially look for alternatives to the state system. So I think that's been very detrimental to the British UK education system, because I believe that the best education system is one where all parents get to take their kids, no matter what their background is, and have a high quality, publicly paid for education system. And I think that in very subtle ways, they encouraged people to get a little bit despondent with the public education system there and move towards other choices and towards privatization, which I hope, and I've seen it here in British Columbia over the last 10 years. It's a little bit scary to think that some of that sort of hidden agenda is taking place, where the government says very positive things about public education, while at the same time sort of undermining it by not resourcing it properly, and therefore, you know, encouraging people to look at alternatives. So I would much rather that we were able to compare the BC education system with Finland or the Netherlands and look at some of the more positive outcomes. Think about how we can perhaps give more supports to our children prior to them coming to the K-12 system, because I think that's one of our biggest challenges now, is to make sure that children are ready to learn when they come into the school system, and think about putting resources into that area.
You're striking on the difference among people now.
Yeah.
What kind of person goes into education? I mean, are they seeking to ruthlessly compete to earn the most money? Boy, they picked the wrong field. Or are they the type of person that wants to be a part of a social movement, a community effort, a team that will elevate other human beings? I mean, you know, there are a lot of professions like that. In fact, I would submit most people in general aren't seeking to make every last dollar they can out of society. They want balanced lives, and they want a workplace that's balanced. And teachers are among those, and other educators. One of the things I feel you're getting onto is the authoritarian nature of governance in the province in education. I was struck by that coming from the United States, because in the United States, the school boards have much more authority, and the superintendent works for them. And here, technically, the superintendent works for the board, but in fact, it feels more like they work for the ministry. And so there is a lot of top-down authority in this system.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I was on the school board in Burnaby for 9 years and chair for 2 years. I felt like a lot, I actually differ with you a little bit on that. I felt like a lot of what we did was created at the local level, and we could be very creative in a lot of ways. But increasingly, I did see not just, you know, top down, but wild swings. This week we're going to do this. Next week we're going to do that. We have to change the way we're reporting. I mean, it's really tough on teachers. So, you know, we talk about, you're asking us about changes and innovations. I think part of it is letting the school boards and the creativity of great teachers, professionals, loose and helping them and assisting them. But we also want to be very careful about coming in and saying, oh my God, the flavor of the day is this. We're going to change everything. Because I think the systems, the school trustees and the teachers are tired of having everything change, you know, weekly almost.
Particularly as it was done in the context of reduced resources within the system as a whole,
Yeah.
right? It's one thing to make change when you're actually giving greater resources to be able to affect that change. It's another thing when you're expecting change at the same time while you're surreptitiously cutting resources. And that's, I think, what created so much dysfunction in parts of our administration of the school
Yeah,
system. And
yeah.
we need to go back to just allowing things to be as they are, allowing school districts to make decisions, and hopefully, as a government, finding the resources to make a reinvestment back into our school system and let it stabilize for a while. Let teachers not have to deal with a new program every other month
Yeah,
coming down from the Ministry of Education.
And people should know that some of the provinces function this way. Education isn't the center of political controversy in all the provinces. They haven't had a strike in Manitoba since the 50s.
Yeah.
And there's a spirit of rapprochement among the different stakeholder groups there because they put education outside the zone of politics and regard it as a public trust. So it can be done, and it's done in Canada in some places.
One of the things that I think we need to do in the public education system as well is to foster, we've started to do it, foster more diversity in the programming for students. You know, I think you'd have to spend less money on trying to discipline students or, you know, look after behavioral problems, not that there's not some real serious issues with some students, if you engage them. So I think that it's a positive approach that you should be taking to education is that, okay, more trades training in the schools because some kids just flourish and they find their life's career path. If they have more access to music, more access to acting programs, more access to school sports, you know, all of those things, engaging students is the way to keep them in the system and successful.
Well, I wish we had more time, but thank you both, Kathy and Robin, for
Thank
your
you.
comments on education, and good luck if you get in office and realizing your visions.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back in a moment. One great myth that is out in the land is that wealth is vital to happiness, and there is a direct relationship between wealth and happiness. From this assumption, a number of conclusions follow. For example, there is something deficient in people who consign themselves to middle-class jobs with no chance of large financial gains. Similarly, something is missing in those who do not seek to be in competitive environments where achievements in work place you ahead of your peers in the workplace. Worst of all, what kind of person would give up pay increases in the interest that others in their workplace might have their salaries raised to parity within the team or cohort? What I have described is the tension between the values of teachers and their unions and the great free market myth I outlined earlier. Teachers do all these things. They forfeit the chance for great wealth. They create a collegial workplace free of competition among employees for their share of the money pie. And they do not pit one specialty against another to create pay tiers among teachers. But teachers are not alone in sharing these values. I submit that a majority of Canadians favor similar practices. They select careers that lead to lives balanced among many factors, not merely earning potential. They seek teamwork and collegiality in the workplace, and they prefer harmony with their coworkers rather than ongoing rivalry. The great mystery is how a value system characterized by dog-eat-dog capitalism keeps its place in our public mythology when other values clearly drive the majority of our citizens. Could our mass media have something to do with this disconnect? Is it possible that advertising driving consumerism colors our perception of the relative importance of wealth in our lives? Which values do you live by? Which do you want taught to our children in our public schools? Together, we do have the authority to set that agenda. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Visit our archive at youreducationmatters.ca.